So, in addition to some book discussions, I am occasionally going to use this channel to talk about some subjects that are just on my mind or that have been kind of percolating in online spaces where I want to chime in. So, today I want to talk about censorship and, in particular, a kind of worrying trend in the publishing industry to go back and censor or revise or edit books to accord with modern sensibilities. There have been a couple of cases of this that have been fairly prominent. I think Roald Dahl has probably the one that generated the most noise, but I think P.J. Woodhouse was one of the authors that's been changed, as well as Ian Fleming, and I'm sure there have been others. Now, exactly the reason why publishers have decided to do this is a little unclear. I don't know the exact history or the story for each one of these authors, but at some point, some editorial team decided it was a good business decision or some kind of moral imperative for them to go through authors' works and change them. Oh, and in fact, they aren't all dead authors. R.L. Stine had books changed as well, and he's still alive, and apparently it was done without his consent. So a lot of people have decided that they want to weigh in on this and that they have thoughts about it. Some of the thoughts have been a little muddled, and I want to kind of clearly state my view. Censorship is bad, and in general, we shouldn't do it. I would be hard-pressed to find cases that I actively agreed with. So I don't think any of the cases that I have seen so far have been cases that I would agree with. And this includes, I would say, parts of James Bond novels where the characters say things that are very offensive and that are wrong. There's a lot of racial stereotypes, or in Roald Dahl, I think there are some anti-Semitic stereotypes. But I would say, despite all of this, it is still, in fact, a bad idea to begin censoring books. And I am going to make the argument kind of in a couple of parts and break this up, and then and maybe this will generate a little bit of a discussion. We'll see. So, first of all, no censor in history has ever thought that they were doing something wrong. Anyone who has ever decided that they were going to censor a book has thought that they were on the right side of history, to use a phrase that I quite dislike, or have generally thought that they had a good reason for doing so. Even tyrants who have thought that they needed to censor books in order to cement their reign thought that they had some kind of right, or thought they had some kind of moral justification for what they were doing. In the 20th century, when we saw this massive conflict, a global conflict in the struggle between sort of Western liberal democracies and communism, both sides engaged in extreme censorship campaigns. They did this in slightly different ways, though. One of the clearest cases of this was that we had House investigations into un-American activities, and we had censors in Hollywood who were actually looking for communist propaganda that would be implicit in movies, and they would try to get rid of them. They would actually try to censor these works, and they would try to make sure that actors or directors or something who were communist couldn't get jobs. And then in the Soviet Union, we see many of the authors that we consider to be greats of 20th century Russian literature. One who stands out to me a lot because I recently read him was Yevgeny Zamyatin. We saw them being censored by writers' unions within the Soviet Union, and they were being they were unable to publish their work. They were unable to publish the work that they had written because it was not ideologically pure. Everyone involved in that censorship thought they were doing the right thing. Those people who were trying to censor communists in the United States thought that communism represented an existential threat to the United States and tried to get rid of all messaging, and they would have justified it by saying they wanted to justify the American way of life or democracy or something like this. And the Communist Writers Union, it wasn't even necessarily the government, the Writers Union would censor these authors first. They did it because they valued a kind of ideological purity, because they saw themselves as waging a conflict against the forces of capitalism. My point is, every single censor who ever tries to change a book is going to tell you that they're doing it for a good reason. And even if they can make an initially plausible case, in general, we have looked back and said, actually, that was bad. You shouldn't have done it. Occasionally, publisher will release the uncensored version of a classic. I believe Ulysses is a famous example of this, where censors would not allow it to be published as the author intended. And now we go back and we celebrate the fact that we can read them and that they can be sold again. We say, oh, they shouldn't have censored those books back then, and now we can read the uncensored books, and that's good. But the troubling trend is that now we're starting to think, well, maybe if we're the ones censoring, maybe if we do the censoring now, we'll do it better. So we'll only censor the bad stuff and not censor the good stuff, which brings me to my second point, which is that once you start a trend of censorship, you have no idea what is going to get caught up in it. This is one of the strongest arguments for free expression in general, which is that if you start to censor work, you are contributing to a culture of censorship, which will extend beyond like whatever borders you've begun, right? If you are some political conservative who wants to ban books from libraries at schools, do not be surprised when then people who you view as your ideological enemies start trying to ban books that you like from schools, or they start to ban books that you like from being published or getting the contracts canceled or something like this. And if you think that some of these censored works in publishing that we've been talking about should have been censored because they are ideologically problematic, because they're racist or they're sexist or they're just mean or something, as in the case of Dahl, do not be surprised when more stuff than you intended eventually gets caught up in this wave. People will start to say, well, that looks mean too, and it wouldn't have been something you would have ever thought of, right? Once censorship begins, it just tends to grow and grow and grow and grow. And as we censor more, just the more speech becomes restricted, the less can be said. So to review, the first 2 points are, everyone thinks that they are censoring for a good reason, and history typically looks back on them and says, no, they weren't. And 2, when you start censoring works, it is very difficult to constrain what you are censoring. So censoring well or being a targeted censor just really does not seem to work. 3, by censoring works by older or deceased authors, we are actually misrepresenting their work to future generations. So suppose that at least some of the stuff that's been censored by these publishers is actually bad. I'd be willing to grant that it's like morally bad. Now, when someone reads those works, they're going to read it, and they're not going to realize that that author had, racist views, or that, say, a racist view or a sexist view was so common 100 years ago. We are actually giving them a picture of history that makes it look more palatable than we should. We should be willing to face the sort of dark sides of our history, reading it in literature, understanding that great writers could write great books that could still be infected by kind of awful beliefs sometimes. And we should be willing to have conversations about how great people can believe terrible things, in part because that gives us an opportunity for reflection. What are the terrible things that I might believe that I need to change on, right? One of the ways that we do moral reform in the present age is by realizing what people overlooked in past ages. So we actually look at history to understand how they went wrong, and maybe that's going to teach us something about where we've been going wrong as well. Kids who are being presented with, these censored and whitewashed versions of literature are actually being robbed of a chance for a moral education. So it's a way for them to actually teach about what is right and what is wrong. The fourth argument is more aesthetic, but I do think it actually matters. The people who are censoring these works are bad writers. There are lots of examples that you can find online of all of these cases where, just look at it, like these are bad writers. They have botched the prose. They have changed the meaning of the sentence in order to make it more ideologically palatable. They have, in general, just done a really poor job. We read certain writers, their work stays in print mostly because it's good. And someone who's, an editorial assistant who decides that they're going to go through and try to line edit some great children's book to make it nicer, they're just not going to do a good job. And my fourth point actually comes from a recent speech that was given by the rapper Killer Mike. And this was for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, I believe they're called. And he basically gives this impassioned argument for free speech on the grounds that free speech lets him know who his enemies are. If we have a culture of free expression, which includes a culture of free expression in publishing, we actually understand what other people believe. So Killer Mark kind of puts it like, when someone says something awful in front of me or to me, even as an insult, that lets me know what kind of person they are. If we begin to censor and editorialize and just prevent these people from ever even expressing their views, then what we're actually doing is tricking ourselves into thinking that no one believes these things. So if you are someone who thinks that sexism is bad and that racism is bad, it's actually really helpful if you know that there are still sexists and racists out there, or that they were in the past. It's good to know, right? Because it tells you that there's still a problem that needs to be solved. I'm kind of a fundamentalist about this point. I think that free expression is just an essential ingredient of being a member of a free society. And I'm probably not willing to budge on that point. And I've appreciated some of the nuanced discussions that people have tried to have about when it's okay and when it's not. But I think that really, while they're trying to be nuanced and fair, I think really you just got to put your foot down and say, censorship is bad. We should stop censoring works, even works that we disagree with, even works that we think are bad. So those are my quick thoughts. Censorship is bad. We shouldn't do it. And I want to say it clearly. I love to hear what you have to say, though. So let me know down below.